Hello, Fiendlings. How the hell are you? Welcome to the first episode of The Black Oceania. If you're not familiar with the Black series, I suggest you go back and start with the first or the third book, Outbreak. That will familiarize you with backstory for the main character as well as some of what she experienced. However, I think you can enjoy the book as it is. A couple of things before we get going. First off, I'm not a trained voice. I pick up accents and perform them as best I can. That said, several of the characters in this work are Australian. I hope I may be forgiven for my meager talents when it comes to accents. Secondly, Oceania hasn't yet been published. I'm awaiting cover and layout for the novel, so until that's ready, it won't be available for sale at Amazon or anywhere else. If you want to help with production costs for this book and for the series finale, Extinction, please consider purchasing some of my other titles and audiobooks, tip me using buymeacoffee.com, or join my Patreon for exclusive audiobooks months or years before the general public gets their talons on them. Links are in the show notes. Thirdly, although the Black series has always taken place in the near future, Oceania prognosticates certain environmental damage to the areas surrounding Papua New Guinea. Some of the information in the novel is accurate, while the rest is me imagining worst-case scenarios. For those fictionalized details, I hope I may be forgiven. Now with all of that off my chest, let's get into it. Be safe, have a great weekend, and we'll talk again Wednesday. Here's episode 1 of The Black Oceania. Prologue. The narrow, long wooden boat puttered through the green water, a thin rooster tail following in its wake. Way sat at the stern on the short stool he'd installed long ago. His gnarled and scarred left hand moved in smooth, gentle arcs to keep the boat on course despite the currents. Last night's storm had brought the ocean right to his front door, the wind and rain ripping at the thatch like greedy fingers that couldn't quite grasp. It wasn't until mid-morning that the waters receded, and the Duke of York Islands saw their few remaining beautiful white sandy beaches return, although not as white nor sandy as before. Storm brought debris, and this one had been no different. Last month's tsunami had delivered trash from all over the ocean, including the contents of a shipping container filled with sex toys, hundreds of liters of now empty leaded paint cans, and enough plastic garbage to litter New Ireland. The remaining permanent inhabitants of the Duke of York Islands relied upon tourists for nearly every aspect of their livelihoods. That meant that whenever a storm brought the shit, the natives banded together to clean the beaches. The eco-people, almost all of them white and naive, Way thought, hailed it as an example of a people treating their environment responsibly. Sure, there was that, but the simple truth was, without beauty, there was no money. In the not-too-distant future, Way gave it 15 years, most of the archipelago would be underwater. The clock was running. Everyone had to make their money while they still could until the government of PNG came in to save them. PNG had already resettled thousands to New Ireland. What was a few dozen more people? Still, the sight of the lagoon's vibrant, clear green water was one he wanted to remember until he closed his eyes for the last time. He couldn't imagine living anywhere else, but inevitably the ocean would bury his home. For now, however, he was on trash patrol, circling the island in his tiny boat and looking for anything valuable that might have washed up and been missed. Maybe some batteries for all those sex toys, he said aloud with a chuckle. A large fish turned over in the water near the shore, creating a circular wave that radiated outward before the current smashed it into a gradually vanishing, broken parabola. That was a good sign. The fishing had been bad for weeks, maybe as long as a month now. It was as if the fish had found better places to be than the archipelago. Considering the pollution outside the channel and along New Ireland's eastern coast, Way couldn't imagine why any form of life would prefer it to the tiny island chain's still clear waters. Well, relatively clear, he told himself. Most of the water near the beaches was still crystal, but there were areas where the rising ocean had swallowed tourist villages, washing away the traditional-looking, but manufactured, huts and encampments. God knew how many gift shop items and souvenir glasses lay at the ocean bottom. No one dove there. A sewer line had erupted and corrupted the water, not to mention the fact something else was seeping out of it. The PNG Ministry of Ecology and Tourism had marked it out of bounds with buoys and nets, spreading for a 100-meter square from the beach. Way didn't like going anywhere near it and didn't know anyone who did. The good thing about leading wealthy customers on coastal fishing tours was that he rarely had to get into water that rose above his waist. If there were pollutants, he was more likely to eat them than drown in them. On second thought, that wasn't so reassuring. The sun had moved behind a large puffy cloud, transforming the ocean from its normally vibrant blue to an impenetrable slate gray. Another fish flipped over with a splash, and Wei grinned again. His customers would be tipping quite well this week. A wave from the channel rolled in and rocked his narrow, long boat, making him curse in a spray of tobacco juice. He turned and looked south where the wave had come from. He didn't see any ships out there, but he froze, and his bemused expression melted into one of concern before turning upward into a grin. There were no ships, but there was a boat, and it was drifting. He'd nearly missed it against the sun's diminishing light, but now it was impossible not to see the bright red and yellow striped exterior. How had he not noticed it? Wei brought the motor to idle and checked the channel waters. Instead of the rushing whitecaps that had roared through yesterday and last night, the ocean looked calm and nearly glassy. Smiling, Wei turned the tiller and guided his boat into the channel's open water. The target boat looked like it had moved further away, but he knew that was an illusion. Always was this time of day. The light got tricky with the sun's lower edges crawling beneath the horizon. Wei felt a sense of urgency that he didn't quite understand. Maybe it was the possibility of easy money to be found aboard a company's derelict or missing lifeboat. The boat might be worth a lot of money, even if no dead tourists or refinery workers were inside. It would be his to barter. They would have to come to him, too. Good fishing, a wreck to search, a chance for more money, and more possibilities. It was looking to be a good week. While his mind turned over scenario after scenario where he escaped the islands with enough money in his pocket not to live his life in a hovel, Wei increased the throttle and fought against the currents pulling at the long boat. The lifeboat now had his full attention. A glaring red paint had started to glow in response to the fading sunlight. The abrasive paint job wasn't the most eye-catching detail. The boat had been severely damaged. Its top, a massive hatch large enough to fit 3 or 4 people at a time, had deep scratches along its edge. Several stumpy remains of what he assumed were antennae stuck out like stubby, black, broken fingers. No GPS for the beacon, he muttered. If it had had one, the damage to the antennae had likely rendered it useless. Maybe that was why its owners hadn't come looking for it. Rain and the ocean had washed away most of the ash and burn marks, but splotches of peeled and puckered paint spoke of a fire with a lot of heat. As he closed within 30 meters, he knew why the boat looked so wrong. It hung low in the water, as though the next large wave might send it to the ocean bottom. How was that possible, though? The hatch looked sealed, and he couldn't imagine anything getting through the thick steel. Maybe it had taken on a lot of water before it was jettisoned. More importantly for him, whom did it belong to? Most importantly, how much would the owners pay? Growling to himself, he opened the throttle with renewed urgency. The chances of finding someone alive inside had dropped to near zero, not to mention the probability of a somewhat fresh corpse. The boat looked as though it might have been drifting for days, maybe since last month's tsunami. Several fish turned over between him and the lifeboat, and the sudden splashes caused him to start and turn the motor sharply in response. His boat listed to one side, and he expertly tipped it back to center. Another curse erupted from his mouth, this one vile enough to bring a beating from the nuns. 5 meters. Another round of splashes. "Fish are hungry," he said aloud, but his voice quivered. The sun was halfway into the water now, and disappearing quickly. "Anyone there?" he called out in broken English. No response. He called again, this time in broken Spanish. Still no response. Wei pulled a rope from the supply box, tied it to his gunwale, and tweaked the motor a few times. When the two craft were alongside one another, he climbed up his riverboat's gunwale and used it as a step to reach the craft's short, built-in ladder rungs. A word glared at him from beneath the porthole, a soothing blue logo beside it. Wei's English wasn't the best, especially when it came to reading, but he sounded out the word. "Leaguer," he said aloud. Strange name. The initials were much easier. P.P.E. The word leaguer sounded familiar, although he wasn't sure why. Hadn't it had something to do with last month's tsunami? He wasn't sure. He'd have to ask Jana if she remembered what leaguer meant. PPE was obviously the boat's owner, and since the symbol contained the outline of an oil rig, he was pretty damn sure they'd pay handsomely, even more than he thought they would before. His brown-toothed grin reappeared. He slapped the side of the boat and immediately regretted it, wondering if he'd managed to break his palm. The lifeboat was made of thick steel. Spider webs of cracks covered the porthole, making it impossible to see inside. Did these things have generators for air and electricity? If they did, that might be something he and his friends could salvage. He climbed atop the lip of the hatch and froze. The hatch itself was more than just ajar. A jagged parabola of bent steel made it impossible for the hatch to close. Damage from an explosion? Explosion. Oil rig. Lifeboat. Shit, he said, and pulled a small penlight from his dungarees. Way walked across the broad hatch to the broken side and leaned down. After a brief moment of peering into the darkness, he activated the penlight and shined it into the depths of the boat. The light wasn't strong enough to show him all the detail he desired, but it was enough to be sure of one thing. The boat had no corpses. More than a meter of water had filled the large lifeboat, presumably getting in through the partially mangled hatch. Maybe even a porthole, if the one on the other side had taken more damage. No one got in the boat, he said in talk. Explosion. Rig. Leaguer. Tsunami. Fuck, Way said in English. In truth, it was the only word he knew how to pronounce correctly. Well, that and tip. The rig had been reported lost a day or so after the tsunami. If he remembered the PNG press statements, rescue operations for the rig had ceased nearly as soon as they'd begun. Why was that? No survivors. No lifeboat beacons. Not even an oil slick left to mark where the rig had been. But the boat was here. How had it escaped notice for so long? That, however, was somewhat obvious. If it had been caught in the tsunami, it had more than likely been swept away from the destroyed oil rig and pushed across the ocean by the waves and the storm. Once caught in the currents, it could have made its way farther in, past Port Moresby, and into the archipelagos. Improbable, but not impossible, because it was here. He was touching it, and it was legitimate salvage. The only problem was, he'd need help getting it to shore. Without some strong arms and wrecking bars, maybe even a welding torch, he didn't think anyone was getting inside the boat. Maybe one of the children could get inside? His own children were long grown up, gone from the DOI, and spread throughout the other islands. One even worked for the government of PNG in Port Moresby. It was a low-paying federal job, but still a job. All of his children were employed or had children of their own now. For someone like him, it was about the best outcome he could have imagined when he sired them. Rika still had a young one at home, maybe 8 or 9 years old. Yes, Way thought. John could fit through there. Tie a rope to him, send him in with a powerful lamp, and maybe he could find some valuables, and they could forget about trying to pop the damaged hatch. But the generator, said a greedy voice in his mind. If there's a generator, how will you remove it if you can't enter the boat? Doesn't matter, he told the voice. If we don't get it back to shore, it's going to sink, and then it'll be worth nothing to no one. The sun had all but disappeared. He climbed down from the large lifeboat and carefully slipped back onto his own. After spending a few moments rummaging through his supply box, he found what he was looking for. His radio didn't have enough range to talk to anyone in the hills from here, but he could reach them if they were out on the sea. After turning it on and dealing with static loud enough to hurt his ears, he turned up the squelch and thumbed the receiver. "We're calling Rika. Over." No response. Sighing heavily, he expertly spat another stream of tobacco juice over the side and tried again.
"Rika here. Over,"
she said in talk.
"You find more sex toys?"
Wade chuckled. "You need some?"
"I have a husband,"
she said curtly.
"He's adequate."
Wade laughed, wondering what her husband would think of that statement. "I didn't find sex toys, no, but I did find something big and I need help getting it to shore." There was a pause.
"How big?"
"Big," he said again. "Need a big boat to haul it." She sighed again.
"You want me to bring Tomas all the way there because his boat is bigger than yours?"
He rolled his eyes. "Rika, this is something someone will pay a lot of money to get back. I won't say more than that over the radio."
"Share?"
"Share," he said in talk. 1/3.
"Half,"
she said. Wei's eyes narrowed. "Hey, I found it. By all rights, it's mine." When Rika spoke again, he heard the devil in her voice.
Finding and taking are two very different things. You can't get it to shore by yourself. So either you let the sea deal with it, or you get my help. My help is worth 50%.
He glared at the radio momentarily before his eyes flicked back to the red and yellow boat. Twilight was turning to night. If they didn't get a move on, he'd either have to stay here all night with his prize or risk it floating away where he might never find it again. Half, he said finally, but whatever's inside is mine. Rika was quiet for a moment.
Inside? What is it, Way?
Can't say now. Get Thomas down here and bring your little one, too. We might need him.
What could you possibly need a 9-year-old for?
Salvage, Way said. After checking his GPS, he rattled off the coordinates. Got it?
Got it,
she said.
I'll get back to you after I contact Tomas.
Copy. Out. Way kept the radio on but turned the volume down. He listened to the waves rock against the massive steel bell and heard the water sloshing inside the enclosed boat. This time tomorrow night, he might be a very rich man. Chapter 1. An alarm buzzed and Sarah's eyes snapped open. The sound of wind buffeting the fuselage and the roar of engines filled her ears, and the poorly lit cabin told her all she needed to know. She was in the back of a cargo plane. A U.S. military cargo plane, to be specific, or so the rest of the world thought. Her jump seat hadn't been a cramped, uncomfortable airline seat, but something far more spacious and easy to fall asleep in. Compared to her flights to the Middle East during her service, this was traveling around the world in style. The meal service hadn't included booze, but that was okay. Sarah didn't need any, please and thank you. Her headset came to life.
Wakey, wakey, Special Agent,
one of the pilots said. She couldn't remember their names.
We're going to land in about 5 minutes, and you need to prepare for a crash or water landing.
Sarah narrowed her eyes at the 5 massive crates at the plane's rear. Why would I have to prepare for either?
Because,
the pilot said,
Rubal Airfield has sunk nearly a meter in the last 5 years, and it had already sunk half a meter before that. It's technically not a safe place to land.
She knew it was a stupid question, but decided to ask anyway. So why the fuck are we landing there? The pilot chuckled, not at all offended.
Because it's the closest we can get to the Duke of York Islands, and it's where the boat is.
The engines changed in tone, and her stomach fell a few centimeters. Descent. Military style. She leaned over to the bulkhead and opened the shade. Bright sunlight smashed into her retinas, leaving her seeing little more than white. As she waited for her eyes to clear, she tugged at the thin rectangle in her front shirt pocket, and a phone popped into her hand. Once the stars and blankness faded away, she saw blameless blue water, muted lazy whitecaps breaking on its surface, and the hint of verdant green hills off to the north. Sarah yawned extravagantly and stretched at the same time.
Please check your straps,
the pilot said.
If there is a water landing, the emergency kit's beneath your seat. You remember how it all works?
She nodded, although the pilot couldn't see her. Yes. She paused a beat. Be honest, how likely is this? She could practically hear a shrug in his voice.
Neither of us has done this before. You tell me.
Sarah leaned back in her seat and closed her eyes. The temptation to pull the shades nagged at her, but she ignored it. If she was going to hit the water, she wanted to know beforehand. A quick intake of breath, hold 3 seconds, and force it out in a stream. Sarah opened her eyes and stared at the ocean that seemed close enough to touch.
Hard bump,
the pilot said. Just as she thought the plane would touch the water, once tilled earth, now mostly gone to seed, appeared. A second later, the plane jolted hard, bouncing her in the seat and making the straps securing the crates squeak and creak. The engines whined high, the G-forces intensifying to a near-sickening level. Rainforest sped by her in green blurs and shadows, while the engines rose in pitch and volume until she thought her ears would burst. Then the G's subsided. The world became more distinct, and she could suddenly appreciate what she was looking at. Rubal, once the capital of East New Britain, was all but abandoned in the early 2000s due to volcanic eruptions from Vulcan and Tverver. The airport, located east of Kokopo, had remained open off and on for a few more decades before finally being decommissioned alongside Kokopo's evacuation following the last major tsunami. The rising waters and increased frequency of tsunamis and volcanic eruptions constantly threatened all of Oceania. The engines slowed, more or less returning to idle, and the plane taxied lazily toward an abandoned concourse. Sarah made out what looked like a large panel truck that had been manufactured sometime around the advent of the catalytic converter. Several figures stood next to it, each wearing a bush hat. The plane turned and she lost sight of the truck. Instead, she stared again at the blue ocean water, lapping against what once must have been jungle, but was now a dwindling volcanic beach.
We'll be taxiing for a few... Oh.
The plane came to a jolting halt.
Never mind. Welcome to Takawa Airport, and thank you for flying the no-name airlines. We appreciate we were never here.
Sarah rolled her eyes but couldn't help smiling. Even now, she didn't know precisely who she was working for. More, the woman who'd hired her after the Bentab M2 incident hadn't answered that question. At first, Sarah had bought the lie that the woman worked for the CDC, but that cover had been blown open by what happened in Texas less than a week ago. The CDC didn't have those law enforcement resources, and so far as Sarah knew, it didn't have access to that kind of hardware either. Sarah's contract was with the U.S. government itself, not an agency. Whatever more was, she had access to whatever she wanted. This plane and its cargo were proof of that. The engines slowed another few thousand RPM and a new alarm chimed. The seatbelt sign blinked out of existence. Ah, Sarah thought, such a professional touch. She released the harness and slowly stood. One sustained, luxurious stretch later, as she walked into the wide cargo area. The sound of pneumatics activating filled the compartment, and the rear door lowered to the tarmac. Bright sunlight filtered inside, banishing the last of sleep and the remaining shadows. The four figures she'd seen had climbed inside their truck and headed to meet the plane. They stood just a few meters from the open cargo bay door, the panel truck idling. "You, Sarah?" The voice was British but held a hint of an acquired Australian twang. A man just shy of 2 meters tall and clothed in a colorful PNG hunter's rugby jersey took off his bush hat, exposing a hairless skull. "I'm Alan from K&B Construction." K&B Construction. It was the same outfit Moore had commissioned to bolt on as many safety and security features as possible at the doomed Miskatonic University facility. Even Sarah knew the entire project would fail, and they would end up dealing with the aftermath. Still, that hadn't prevented her from taking the assignment. The same went for K&B Construction, she guessed. Regardless, Moore trusted the company, the men who ran it, and apparently their employees as well. Sarah would have to trust them too, especially since she wasn't even sure what she was doing here. Well, that wasn't entirely true. "Hello, Alan," she said, blinking hard against the sunlight. "You're here to—" "We are your escort," a gruff-looking woman said. Alan pointed at her. "That's Rags. Hippie is self-explanatory." Alan continued, pointing to the man beside Rags. His thick braided hair dangled just past his nipples, and his eyes were hidden behind a pair of jet-black sunglasses. "And last but not least," Rags said, pointing to the man standing off to the side, "that's Kojo." Kojo had a linebacker's build, a baby face that hinted at Polynesian ancestry, and a toothy grin. He nodded to her politely. "What do you want me to do?" Sarah asked. Alan jerked a thumb at the truck. "To get in the cab, enjoy the antiquated AC, and relax. We got this." Sarah shrugged and headed down the ramp past the makeshift crew. The panel truck's interior was nothing like its exterior. Instead of ripped pleather seats corroded by time and ocean air, the forward compartment had deep, wide bucket seats, and the rear compartment had been extended to comfortably fit 4 passengers. That still left a large cargo area to store the supplies Moore had sent along. Shauna didn't know what K&B's boat looked like, but she hoped it was large enough for all of this. Counting Sarah and Alan's team, they made 5. She couldn't imagine there wasn't someone currently securing the boat, so that meant a vessel large enough to accommodate 6. But for how long? An afternoon? A day? Sighing, she reached forward and opened the 6-pack-sized cooler. Several bottles of ice-cold, off-brand filtered water stared back at her. Smiling, she plucked one from the cooler, closed it, and held the bottle to her forehead. Unsurprisingly, she'd already begun to sweat. This was a rainforest, after all, with high temps in the balmy region and devastating humidity. The truck shook gently from side to side, and a hollow bang sounded behind her. She quickly looked at the side view mirror and knew there was nothing to worry about. Alan and his crew were loading. At the rate they were going, it wouldn't take long. Sarah yawned again, wishing she had a cup of coffee. She doubted the Gazelle Peninsula had a coffee shop, meaning she'd be at the mercy of whatever the boat had. Another boom and another list in the cargo area. She spun the cap and took a draft from the bottle. The water tasted better than she had imagined and chilled her throat. Whatever else happened for the rest of this mission, Alan had pulled out all the stops to welcome her. At least that was something. She closed her eyes and cradled the bottle, allowing the condensation to cool her arms. Sarah stretched out her toes before curling them in and extending them again. A ritual to recover from jet lag she'd seen in a movie once and had found to be too damn true. The inside of a combat shoe wasn't the same as carpet, but it would have to do for the moment. Or you could just nap. She yawned again. No nap, no. The door slamming shut made Sarah sit bolt upright. She looked over and saw Rags at the wheel, an apologetic smile on the woman's face. Sorry, Rags said. Tried to be gentle. Sarah shook away the cobwebs of her catnap, wondering just how long she'd been out. No problem, Sarah stammered. We loaded up? Rags put the vehicle in gear. And ready to rock. She swung the truck in a slow arc until it pointed at the runway's end and the access road's beginning. Sarah noticed the team's 3 men weren't sitting behind her. Where are they? Only ladies in the cab, Rags said gravely, her Aussie accent deep and nearly indecipherable. Then she smiled. They're taking care of the supplies in the back. Rags paused for a moment. I hear you had a long flight. Yes, Sarah said. Wasn't bad, though. Rags grinned. Flying K&B construction's always a first-class experience, even if it doesn't look like it. Sarah saw a tattoo on the woman's bicep. It said simply, "Fuck your dare," alongside a kangaroo punching a dagger. She wasn't sure, but Sarah thought it was a slight aimed at the British or Australian SAS. What do you do for K&B? Sarah asked, knowing the question was stupid the moment it left her mouth. Logistics and support, Rags said dryly. At least that's what the job title says. What I do is what they tell me to do. Sarah nodded and smiled. Understood, all too well. No doubt. You been sleeping okay? Looks like you were used and abused before you boarded that plane. Either that, or you spent 36 hours getting here. Sleep. Not much sleep, no, Sarah said and stifled another yawn. Slept okay on the plane, but I didn't sleep for nearly a week before that. Dare I ask? Rags said, a hint of certainty in her voice. No, you dare not, Sarah said lightly. For now, anyway. Rags pulled the truck onto a main road that led them to a short incline. Once over the hill, the crystal blue water of Bismarck Bay came into view. Sarah took a deep breath before saying, Beautiful. It is, Rags agreed. She took a left and followed the weed-ridden remains of a main road. See our boat down there? The boat, as Rags had called it, deserved a little more respect. A 30-meter-length power sailor with 10-meter masts wasn't just a boat. It was a damn good-sized boat. That's what we're puttering around on? Sarah asked. Rags chuckled. The boat, her name is Keko Gato, can do more than putter. She's got some nice upgrades. We have a Zode, scuba equipment, the latest sensor technology, and plenty of space for gear. So, Sarah said mockingly, a construction company needs a power sailor. Rags shrugged. Construction and destruction, it's all the same to K&B. I noticed you didn't answer the question, Sarah asked. How do you like the weather? Rags asked. Sarah laughed.